Is your state a winner in recent IRS migration data? Election integrity questions continue to persist. The idea of teaching civil rights, remaining Supreme Court cases, and addressing fraud. This is the Center Square Daily for Monday, June 8th, 2026. I'm your host, Greg Bishop. Right now, millions of Americans, and you may be one of them, making one of the biggest decisions of your life, and that is where to live, work, and raise your kids, and also where to pay your taxes. And people are not just choosing which new zip codes to live in, they're voting by moving trucks and their tax returns to different states. Now, the IRS putting out data, just as other government organizations do, like the U.S. Census Bureau, showing where people are moving from and to. And the latest IRS data tells quite the story. Hundreds of thousands of households, along with billions of dollars in income, are shifting from high tax states like California, New York, and Illinois to lower tax states like Florida, Texas, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Tennessee. Now, one state in this list alone lost over $11 billion in income in just 1 year. Another gained more than $20 billion. But here's what makes this matter to you. Now, no matter where you live in the United States, if you're in a state that's gaining residents, you're feeling the effects on housing prices, schools, roads, and local services. Now, if you're in a state that's losing taxpayers, you're watching your tax base shrink, which often means higher taxes or cuts for people who need it most. Joining us to discuss this issue and the data is Abir Mandal. He's a senior policy analyst with the Tax Foundation. Abir, thanks for taking time with us today. And this data, again, comes out every year. It's always fascinating to see which states are gaining and which are losing. So walk us through some of the biggest gainers and some of the losers in that tax filing for adjusted gross income.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me. So yes, and you're right. The IRS puts out these data every year. And for the latest data that we have from 22-23, the biggest gainers are actually Texas, Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Arizona, in that order. Texas and Florida gained more than 55,000 new tax filers, right? North Carolina almost 40, and South Carolina almost 30. On the other hand, the California actually lost more than 100,000 net filers. New York, almost 72,000. New Jersey, almost 20,000. And Massachusetts, 15,000.
You know, when we put out data from the Census Bureau every year, they give those numbers of people moving from one state to the next. But the IRS data seems to go a little bit further, and that is the focus of what you guys put together in your analysis with the Tax Foundation. Talk about those real tax dollars that people are taking from one state like New York to another state like Florida.
Yes, absolutely. And the data, very categorically show that high earners are moving back and forth, which is, not surprising because, moving costs are not low, right? So like as a proportion of their income, moving costs would be easier for rich people to handle, right? So we can see in the data that Florida saw roughly, about approximately $184,000 in net adjusted gross income per new resident. And then Texas, South Carolina, North Carolina also posting gains with tax returns between 50,000 and 70,000. On the other hand, Massachusetts lost approximately $142,000 per departure, while California saw almost $60,000 per departure. And others like New York, New Jersey also came in that range between $60,000 to $100,000 per departure. So these are real dollars. They're losing high income residents, and that can't be good for them.
Well, and I want to talk a little bit later on about the impacts that has for those who are left behind, right? Who can't pay the higher moving costs. But I mean, you mentioned the individual kind of average per individual filer, but I mean, these are real numbers that add up pretty quick when you start looking at it. Let's take a look at states with the highest adjusted gross income gains. And as you said, Florida at the top of the list, they gained $20.6 billion. That's
Exactly.
fresh money coming into the state of Florida. Texas, $5.5 billion. South Carolina, $4.1 billion, almost $4 billion for North Carolina, and Arizona, $2.76 billion. That's a lot of money moving from one state to the next in just 1 year time.
Yeah, absolutely. And these are, as you said, these are real dollars that fund jobs, that fund new consumption, and they also fund, the new tax revenues for the government, right? So, um, again, like California, for example, lost $12 billion in gross income. New York lost almost $10 billion, and these are again, real jobs leaving the economy, and it makes everybody that's left poorer.
Yeah, the top two states losing adjusted gross income, as you mentioned, California at 11.9 billion, New York almost 10 billion, and to finish out that top five of the biggest losers, Illinois losing $6 billion, Massachusetts almost $4 billion, and New Jersey more than $2.5 billion. Again, that's billion with a B. Abir, Florida gaining $20 billion in net AGI, while Illinois losing $6 billion. You've got some key differences here. What have you found by comparing the states that are gaining not just population but higher income earners versus those states that are losing population and losing those higher income earners? What are the policies that are driving this? Is it the weather, for instance?
Well, I mean, part of it is the weather. I mean, honestly, our research shows that roughly, that obviously, we are tax foundation, so we study tax policy, and so tax policy, from the data, show that approximately 11% of a person's decision to move is driven by a just tax policy. Of course, there are other factors like weather, but then arguably California has some of the best weather in the country, and yet it's one of the biggest losers of taxpayers as well, as the data show. So it's a combination of factors: cost of living, taxes, weather.
Could it be jobs as well? Like, for instance, one state is a more jobs-friendly climate versus another state that may have a whole bunch of taxes on business owners and other types of regulations that make it more burdensome.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if you tax people more, they're likely to leave, but the rich people also leave, and they take their jobs with them. That means that the state that they're going towards becomes better for jobs and job prospects, and therefore they start attracting the middle class and the lower classes as well eventually.
We're talking with Abir Mandal. He is senior policy analyst with the Tax Foundation about IRS data showing which states are the big gainers or which states are the big losers when it comes to your adjusted gross income moving from one state to the next. You touched on this a little bit earlier about the average individual filer moving from one state to the next, and it seems to be more of the higher income earners that can afford to move, and they're going to find places where they're allowed to keep more of their money. How does that impact those lower income individuals who can't pack up and say, I'm voting with my feet?
Yeah, so for the lower income people, in the states that are losing residents, it obviously puts a real pressure on the state budget, right? And therefore, the remaining residents who already don't make that much money, they will probably face higher taxes eventually, because the budget has to be funded somehow, right? So it means um, you're basically concentrating tax revenues from the people who remain, and arguably they are of lower income. So the income base shrinks, and of course, many of these people who are actually who depend on the government for their sustenance. well, they also feel pressure of cuts, and so yeah, it makes things worse for them, definitely.
We've seen proposals across the country, like in New York and I think Washington State. They've got this idea of taxing millionaires
Right.
a certain percentage. Uh, this is just some of the policies that are being floated out there. Some have been approved, and it's being discussed elsewhere. But what would be, I guess, some of the responses and reforms that you've seen from states that are gaining versus states that are losing?
Usually, the states that attract these residents, like Florida and Texas, they have simple tax policies, usually low tax rates, and many of them have flat taxes or no income taxes whatsoever, like Florida and Texas. North Carolina is an outlier in the sense that it ranks pretty high when it comes to attractiveness for residents, but it imposes income, sales, and property taxes. So, but the structure of taxes in North Carolina is very, very nice and flat, and so it's very easy to comply, and the tax burden is also much lower. So usually we see simple taxes, we see good policy, we see we don't see soak the rich policies as we are seeing, as you mentioned, in New York and California, right? Which is also driven because they are losing money, due to this out migration that has been taking place in the last few years.
Again, this is all based off of IRS data that's released every year, just showing where tax filers are moving from and where they're moving to. Sometimes this data can correlate with that Census Bureau data, which are the top states that are losing, and they're also losing a lot of money. But I'm curious, in your review of all of this information, were there any outliers that surprised you with states that were, over or underperforming more than you thought they may? Any anomalies, things that made you kind of scratch your head a bit?
Well, I mean, one thing that we saw is that, like, the largest gain when it comes to individual cities was actually in New York City, which was, like, surprising to us. However, if you look at the income data, they lost, in aggregate, they lost income. So what that means is that poorer people actually moved in while richer people moved out of New York City. So that was, like, remarkable, that we could easily see in the data. Another thing that we saw was, like, South Carolina, which did surprisingly well, but they actually have quite a, their top tax rate is like 6.5% or so, which is high as compared to some of the others, like North Carolina and of course Florida and Texas, that do not have income taxes at all. So.
Well, it's fascinating, and I'm sure we could spend an entire hour
So yeah,
breaking down the information even further. Well, Abir Mandal, Senior Policy Analyst with the Tax Foundation, greatly appreciate you taking the time with us today, and we'll definitely connect with the Tax Foundation further on such stories and more comparisons of states across the country and how you, the taxpayer, are being impacted right here with the Center Square Daily. When you went to bed June 2nd, you thought the primary in Los Angeles was over, but right now in LA, the mayor's race is still moving. Spencer Pratt's lead for second place, as we showed you last week, well, now it's disappeared as new ballots keep dropping in, and Nithya Raman just took the spot by a few thousand votes. Why? The election was last week. Well, because California is one of only 14 states that keeps counting mail ballots after Election Day. Does your state do that? Well, today we're laying out exactly which states let this happen, which ones demand every ballot is in by the time the polls close, and why the numbers in places like LA are still shifting while the rest of the country seems to have moved on. But before we review those states that have mail in ballots being counted well beyond Election Day, let's take a look at some of those numbers out of California, starting with that LA mayor's race. Countless number of candidates, but only 2 are going to go off into the November election. And if you look at the data from last week compared to just this morning when we checked the results that are still pouring in, you have Karen Bass still at top. But last week, Spencer Pratt was at number 2 and Nithya Raman was at number 3. But this week, that's changed. Nithya Raman now in second place as Spencer Pratt is in third. And if that trend continues, the official numbers will have the LA mayor's race between Bass and Raman rather than between Bass and Pratt. So that's going to be an ongoing story. It's even been something that's been highlighted over the weekend in an interview that President Donald Trump gave to Meet the Press, questioning what's going on in California. But it's not just the LA mayor's race, it's also the governor's race, where last week, Steve Hilton, a Republican, came in second place, almost ensuring that he was going to take on Xavier Becerra in that race in November. And Democrat Tom Steyer last week was in third place. But this week, almost the same story as in LA. Hilton now in third, with Steyer rising to number 2 as the numbers of mail-in ballots continue to come in the state of California. So what's happening? Well, you've got a variety of different questions about election integrity that some Republicans in Congress are trying to get states to adhere to, like restricting mail-in ballots to only those who serve in the military overseas or individuals who have health issues that are keeping them from going out to vote on Election Day or even taking part in early voting that happens. President Donald Trump even went as far as to issue an executive order to impose a nationwide Election Day receipt deadline. But that was enjoined in the courts last year. So state rules, the way they are, they currently apply. So which states allow for ballots to be counted after Election Day? 14 states across the country do this. Washington, the District of Columbia, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands allow mailed ballots to be counted if they arrive after Election Day, but they have to meet certain criteria. They have to be postmarked and follow different types of rules to ensure that that ballot is legitimate. But here's just a breakdown of some of the other states and jurisdictions that allow for counting ballots past the Election Day. In Alaska, they postmarked by Election Day. If they're received within 10 days, they can be counted. In California, as we've highlighted, they have to be postmarked by Election Day and received no later than 7 days after the election. So that cutoff day is tomorrow, Tuesday. In D.C., postmarked on Election Day, received within 10 days after Election Day as well. You've got Guam, very similar. Illinois, if the ballot is postmarked on or before Election Day, it has to be received within 14 days after Election Day, not 10 days, a full 2 weeks. I'm talking with elections officials in Illinois. They say the bulk majority of those mail-in ballots come in within just a few days after the election, and rarely do they continue to flood in all the way up to the 14 days. But that question in Illinois has been challenged in the courts, as have other states across the country, on when they have to have a deadline to have ballots counted by. In Maryland, if the ballot's postmarked on or before Election Day and received within 10 days after Election Day, then they can be counted. Massachusetts, another state that allows for ballots to be counted after Election Day, but they have to be postmarked on or before Election Day. Mississippi, postmarked on or before Election Day. If they're received within 5 business days, they can be counted. But obviously all of this, it could come into flux with the U.S. Supreme Court ruling on federal preemption of this rule. Now, Nevada, they postmark their election ballots. If it's received by 5 p.m. on the 4th day after an election, then those can be counted. New Jersey, they have 144 hours spelled in. So they have to be postmarked on or before Election Day. And if they are received within 144 hours of the close of the polls, they can be counted. Now, non-postmarked ballots received within 48 hours of the close of the polls, those may also be valid there in that state. Again, that was New Jersey. New York, if a ballot is postmarked by Election Day, then you'll receive it 7 days after Election Day. It can be counted. Elections officials in Oregon, they say postmarked or on Election Day. And if it's received within a week after Election Day, it can be counted. And various other jurisdictions like Puerto Rico also have similar types of provisions. And even Texas, if it's postmarked on or before Election Day and received on the day after Election Day, then it can be counted. And again, other jurisdictions like Virginia, they've got a similar provision. If it's received before noon on the third day after an Election Day, then it can be counted if it fits certain provisions. Washington State as well, postmarked on or before Election Day, then the ballot can be counted no later than the day before certification, which is actually up to 21 days after a general election or 14 days after a primary. West Virginia, another of the 14 states that allows for postmarked ballots to be received after Election Day and still be counted. So that's just a list now. Again, a lot of different provisions here with each state having different types of policies in place. And that may be something bolstering Republicans who are looking for some uniformity across the country when it comes to federal elections. Now, despite the president of the United States issuing that executive order that a court has put on hold, the push continues in the U.S. Senate with voter ID laws and issues to try to rein in ballots that are being counted after Election Day. And even the U.S. Supreme Court has a case delving into this question that still has yet to be addressed. These are obviously going to be some pretty important questions as you've got another election set for tomorrow as states across the country continue to head to the polls, including in Maine, where our team from the Center Square will be watching closely. And if you didn't hear your state in that list of 14 states, likely accept those ballots only up to Election Day. But we'll continue to watch this issue and more, not just in the Supreme Court, but also these states, tomorrow's primaries in Maine, Nevada, and North Dakota. Be sure to stay up to date with thecentersquare.com. Just 22% of 8th graders are proficient in civics, according to the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Now, the NAEP civics assessment measures students' understanding of democratic citizenship, government, and American constitutional democracy. Now, these are future voters and future taxpayers. Former UN Ambassador Andrew Young, he's advocating for more civics engagement among young people. And he draws from experiences he had following civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. Joining us to discuss her latest article at thecentersquare.com, Civil Rights Curriculum Aims to Shape Future Leaders, is the Center Square education reporter Esther Wickham. Esther, thanks for taking time with us. Andrew Young, for people who don't know who that is, go ahead and tell us about his professional background and also his connections to Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Greg, for having me. So I had the privilege to speak to former UN Ambassador Andrew Young. He is pivotal when it comes to the civil rights movement. As you said, he was a very close friend and honestly Martin Luther King Jr.'s right-hand man during many pivotal moments in the civil rights movement. Following that, he did have some time with the UN as a UN ambassador and also as the former mayor of Atlanta. And so he has some political background. And so he's definitely been an activist and has had many places in advocacy, and he definitely has an emphasis in education as he values future generations. He recognizes that it's important for young kids to know what happened in the past so they can kind of move on for current forces, and also for the future to understand what is important and how to educate young people now and in the future to figure out, what is best for society and for the world to progress. And so I was able to speak with him on a myriad of levels, speaking about this specific curriculum that we're going to talk about today, but also his time with Martin Luther King Jr. during the civil rights movement. And it was just incredible to hear so many stories he had to say.
Oh, and the history, I imagine, just kind of looking back, you learn about some of that in school, but to talk to somebody who is actually involved with a lot of that has got to be invigorating. Esther, talk a little bit about the civics education that is currently in schools and how much that's progressed, and what exactly Mr. Young is looking for when it comes to the outcomes of this curriculum.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just like you said, Greg, we're at, 22% proficient in civics. That means that, about 78% of students are not proficient in civics education. And that's not only civil rights or understanding what happened in the 1960s, but also just our American history, the Constitution, the founding fathers, why America started, and what's the importance of 1776. This is something that is not really being highlighted or valued in the education system, and that's only in K through 12. We're also seeing this significant decline as well in college, and this is important because it shapes a generation. It shapes students to figure out what happened so that history doesn't repeat itself. They can learn from mistakes or from positive actions of leaders. And so if you ask students to kind of summarize or tell us about it, they can't necessarily do that. And so Ambassador Young, when speaking with him, he endorsed this recent curriculum. It's called the Civil Rights: A Global Perspective, powered by McGraw-Hill Education. He's one of many experts and historical leaders that endorse this curriculum because it doesn't just focus on our differences. It focuses on what unites a society, what unites people. And he believes, which I think what this curriculum fundamentally teaches, which is why he strongly supports it, is the teachings of Dr. King, focusing on empathy, brotherhood, perseverance, unity. These are pivotal things that I think he believes changed the civil rights movement, actually made it extremely effective. And, he, as well as Dr. Matthew Daniels, talks about, well, anyone can go out and protest, but it takes, some time and perseverance to actually make those protests and make your voice heard in an effective way to change and move a generation. And I think that's what we saw in the civil rights movement. And I think that's why Ambassador Young endorses this curriculum to kind of reshape and educate students about the teachings of Dr. King.
And you of course talked to Ambassador Young for this story, but you talked to, as you mentioned, Anderson University professor Matthew Daniels. Here's some of what he had to tell you about this curriculum.
There's been a real failure to educate young people about how to actually achieve social justice. I remember a few years ago, a group of students in my class in not at Anderson, at another university, approached me and said, Professor, we were all involved in protests during the pandemic, and a lot of us are wondering what difference it made. And I really didn't have the heart to say to them, probably not much, because you didn't even have a goal or an objective. You didn't have a strategy. In every endeavor, in every area of society, if you have no goal, no strategy, no plan, you're probably not going to accomplish much. And that's true when it comes to social justice movements. Just going out and protesting doesn't necessarily lead to any result. It might actually lead to bad results. Again, people have forgotten that the civil rights movement was very deliberate, very disciplined, very strategic in everything they did. And that's one of the reasons they were so effective. However, what we're learning is that by having really de-emphasized civic education, we're paying a terrible price. Because at the end of the day, character is actually the most important object of any educational program.
Esther, as you've reported on in the past, even just a few weeks ago, we saw kids walking out of class to protest immigration enforcement, right? I mean, how does what we saw a couple of weeks ago with those types of protests compare to what Ambassador Young is talking about? It's about what the professor's talking about here. Is it really showing kind of a lack of true understanding about what civic engagement should look like versus what it shouldn't look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I think exactly what Dr. Daniels kind of highlights. It comes down to character and a genuine knowledge for what people are fighting for. When I spoke with Ambassador Young, he highlighted, it wasn't these, the same thing with founding fathers as well. It was a bunch of young people, right? 17, 18, 19. He said that him and Dr. King were fresh out of college. So we're talking about 22-year-olds, trying to fight for a new generation. And we're seeing that same thing here, young students walking out. But I think the difference here, speaking with many other education experts, especially Lance Azumi for Pacific Research Institute, he highlights that, if you ask these students what they're actually fighting for, what they're actually walking out for, I don't think they could fully articulate what's exactly going on. And
they got a day off class. That's
exactly,
at least what I would be thinking if I was a 15-year-old kid and you had a teacher say, hey, we're going to protest immigration and customs enforcement, and they don't really know what that is. They're just like, okay, well, I get a out of class free card for the day.
Right. And what you see with a lot of these protests is they're happening during school because they're specifically student walkouts. So what is happening on the weekends? What is happening, after 3, 4 p.m.? Not a lot of activity. A lot of these walkouts for students are during the school time. And so, yeah, a lot of them, they're like free school day, or if the school district is kind of fearful of ICE or immigration enforcement happening in the area, some kids get off fully for 2, 3, 4 weeks. Their classes are put online like it was back in COVID time. And so there's a difference when adults are kind of self-starting and training this initiative for young people versus what we've seen in the civil rights movement is young people starting it and starting a movement. When I spoke with Ambassador Young, he shared the story of how these young demonstrators and protests in Birmingham, Alabama, came to Dr. King and said, hey, we want to start a movement in Birmingham. And he told Ambassador Young, hey, speak with some white people down there, try and let's have a conversation before we go down there, because the main reason we protest is people know what we're protesting for. And so he shared the story of, he contacted this lady at an Episcopalian church, and he got the churchmen and the bishops together. So these white and black folks had a meeting. He explained how he was there. He saw it go down. It was very respectful. Dr. King explained why they were going down to Birmingham to protest. And that's kind of the spark what we saw happening in Birmingham, Alabama. But it spawned out of these young people self-starting, initiating what they saw as a huge problem. And I think that's kind of a big push that Ambassador Young sees in this curriculum. It teaches students the teachings of Dr. King, as well as, it's not just about civics education, but your character and your heart behind what you actually believe, not just other people telling you what to believe, but what you actually think and see the world.
Is there any indication that there might be efforts to ensure that bias doesn't work into these conversations, right? Thinking back to the education I had about the civil rights movements, of course, there was a lot of nonviolent protests and things that were done with purpose, people taking to the streets nonviolently, but it was a violent era, right? There was a lot of clashes with law enforcement and protesters. Just thinking about the 1968 Democrat Convention in Chicago, for example, right? A lot of violence there. But is there an effort from what you've seen so far to ensure that it's balanced whenever these themes and these ideas are being presented to such young and impressionable minds?
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, the curriculum is something Dr. Daniels, highlighted is it's for K through 12, but it's also for college. and other adults that are willing to kind of engage in this, because it's an online digital platform. So though it's still for 21-year-olds and younger, this is something that they really believe is important, because like you said, even though this is something Dr. King kind of fought for, there was still violence, there was still a lot of things going on in that time. But I think at the end of the day, each unit, as they kind of go through, each unit is highlighted one kind of teaching of Dr. King. So one unit is, we're focusing on perseverance. The next unit, we're focusing on brotherhood, empathy, and so on and so forth. And I think that there is definitely a big push for diversity and making sure that you have this environment to speak your mind and talk about what's been going on in the world today. So there's a highlight for civil discourse we see. And along with this curriculum, Dr. Daniels kind of highlighted that they do have an Ambassador Young program for all students to engage in. It's kind of a scholarship, a week-long program for people, teachers and students to kind of come together and learn more about Dr. King's teachings, and also just trying to figure out, how do we go from here? What have we seen in the past, and how do we move forward to not only focus on what we're fighting for and what we believe in, but also to move about in a way that all of us can feel heard and have civil discourse and just be respectful, because Ambassador Young, highlights that he saw that happen with Dr. King before they went down to Birmingham to protest, and it can still happen today. It's possible. You just got to fight for that civility.
And that fostering of civil dialogue, right? Instead of some of the things we're seeing on the streets as of late between, protesters for one cause and protesters that are counter to that cause, and police having to use limited taxpayer resources to get in the middle and make sure everybody's safe and secure. But it sounds like this is a more of a kind of a review of how to have these political conversations versus the nuts and bolts of civic engagement, right? The hey, there's an election every 2 years to elect members of the House, and this is Schoolhouse Rock's version of how a bill becomes a law type thing. Is that something that schools are going to have the ability to do when they've got limited taxpayer resources?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's kind of the aim for this curriculum, especially McGraw-Hill, and something Dr. Daniels highlighted too is they don't have to just take the curriculum at face value. They're able to take proponents of it and incorporate it in other areas that they're teaching, and it's not just Dr. King as well. They're reading, the story of Rosa Parks, the story of Emmett Till, those kinds of books, just really pivotal Black historical figures in that time and what they did to change a generation. Because now what we're seeing is kind of a loss of that knowledge of civics, of history, especially during that time. And so I think this curriculum aims just to kind of get back to that, so that future generations don't necessarily forget what happened in the 1960s.
Well, Lester Wickham, education reporter for the Center Square, greatly appreciate you taking the time, and what an honor it is to talk to Ambassador Young. It's right here with the Center Square Daily. Now it's time for America's Talking, with some headlines you can find at thecentersquare.com or in the description below. And here is just some of what's being discussed across the country. And we'll start with the U.S. House Oversight Committee report being released today called The Cost of Doing Nothing: How Tim Walz and Keith Ellison Fueled Minnesota's Fraud Explosion. Now, the reports, the House Oversight Committee Republicans say it shows how senior Minnesota officials in the state, including Governor Walz and Attorney General Ellison, were aware of widespread taxpayer fraud in federally funded social service programs for years. and they possessed the authority to stop those payments and ban fraudulent providers from participating in these programs. But the official report from the U.S. House Oversight Committee says those Minnesota officials repeatedly failing to act. Here is what James Comer, the House Oversight Committee chairman, had to say in a statement. Billions of dollars were stolen because Minnesota state leaders turned a blind eye to rampant fraud and retaliated against state employees who dare to raise concerns. It is now clear the Walz administration chose to protect the system rather than the taxpayers. We're seeing the issue of fraud being debated across the country in various state houses. And it's not just one particular program over another. There's a lot of social service net programs that are meant to be that safety net for people, including food stamps or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Years ago, decades ago, people got coupons that acted as food stamps, but now it's on a digital card, an EBT. And there's been some fraud that's been happening with that in Pennsylvania. Legislators looking at having chip-enabled EBT cards to help fight against some of that fraud.
House Bill 2540 modernizes Pennsylvania's EBT system by updating magnetic stripe cards to include secure chip-enabled technology. As benefit theft through card skimming and cloning continues to rise, we have responsibilities to provide recipients with the same security protections that most Americans already receive through their debit cards and their credit cards. For families relying on SNAP benefits to put food on the table, a stolen benefit can mean going without groceries. And unlike traditional bank customers, they often have limited options for recovery. And so this legislation helps prevent benefit theft. It protects taxpayers' dollars, and it keeps Pennsylvania's EBT system aligned with modern national standards.
Now, in Michigan, conversation about fraud, where they're looking at Medicaid and the open enrollment for the Affordable Care Act, and where fraud's happening there. Sabrina Carlette, an advocate, talking to a Michigan State House committee about where she sees most of the fraud happening. Is it the federal or the state level?
In my work, we have consulted with state-based marketplaces across the country. They have seen nowhere near the level of broker misbehavior that we have seen in the federal healthcare.gov system. Now, it's true that, anytime you have, a federally funded program, there is going to be some modest amount of fraud no matter what you do. But I think what clearly happened in 2024 is that brokers were taking advantage of a system vulnerability in healthcare.gov. And what states have done is, they do things like two-factor authentication and other tools to minimize those security risks. They just have seen nowhere near the level of improper enrollments that healthcare.gov has seen.
Now, in California, there's been conversations and a lot of reports about waste, fraud, and abuse in one particular program dealing with autism funding, and that sparked a resolution to ensure that the funds go to where they're needed. We have a state legislator in California talking about the importance of these funds, but also various associations saying that they had concerns of fraud, but there seem to be safeguards in this proposal advancing at the California State House.
In the autism community, they say if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, because it is so different for so many individuals and families on the spectrum. And whether it is needing ABA therapy, whether it's the diagnosis and treatment of other comorbidities, every individual is different. Every need, every therapeutic is different. And it's so vitally important that, and sometimes that changes too. And it's so vitally important that the services are being provided when they're needed most, which is why I would love to be a co-author on this bill. It's vitally important. We need more resources for this community, and this is another starting point. I want to thank you for bringing it forward.
Really appreciate that.
Cassidy Heckman on behalf of the California Association of Health Plans. I want to thank the author, his staff, and the committee staff for working with us on this bill. We had significant concerns with the bill in print due to fraud, waste, and abuse in this area, which, if you've been tracking the news and investigations by the feds and the state, it's been pretty prevalent. That said, we appreciate the amendments that preserve utilization management, And after reviewing them in print, we're looking forward to removing our opposition. Thank you.
Thank you.
So different levels of fraud for different programs, from food stamps to Medicaid to autism funding. But to get a little bit of a sense of just how big of an issue this is for one state in particular, Texas Health and Human Services Inspector General Raymond Winter testified to a Texas committee just about how big of an issue this really is.
According to the National Healthcare Anti-Fraud Association, which is a coalition of government and non-government participants in this area, in this industry, up to 10% of a state's health and human services expenditures are lost every year due to waste, fraud, and abuse. By this metric, Texas loses $5.3 billion annually out of the $53 billion we spend on health and human services. According to another study in 2020 by Taxpayers Against Fraud, the average state loses 6.4% of its overall budget, not just the healthcare budget, but of its overall budget to fraud, waste, and abuse. And under that metric, the loss to Texas would be in excess of $10 billion annually. Of course, every dollar that's lost is not only a theft from taxpayers, but it also means that somebody is not receiving a benefit that they're entitled to. It's a loss for those citizens in Texas who rely on these benefits to put food on the table for their families and to provide health care for their families.
There's going to be a lot more to say about all of these different issues of which particular programs are suffering from fraud and how states in particular are going to go about trying to rein that in. You can stay up to date with some of the latest about what America is talking about by getting the headlines in your inbox at thecentersquare.com. From my studios in Central Illinois, I'm Greg Bishop. Join us back here Tuesday for more stories impacting you, the taxpayer, from all around the country, only with the Center Square Daily.